All right, hello everybody, and welcome to our August 2015 Hangout. I am Jim Pingle. This month we'll be talking about Radius and LDAP and how they pertain to pfSense. Kind of an interesting topic. We get a lot of questions about it now and then. Apologies for my voice, and if I come across a little slow or sound a little funny. I've been under the weather the last couple of weeks, so if I mute the microphone, it's either because I'm coughing or trying to take a drink or not die. So, all right, here we go. A couple of project notes. Our 2.3 version is progressing. We should have public snapshots before too long. We've got some internal development snapshots we've been using with it, and we're making a ton of progress on getting everything merged in and getting lots of stuff going for it. It's really looking very good. So hopefully we'll have something the public can consume pretty quick, and then in a month or two we might do sort of like we did for 2.2. We might do a hangout on a preview of 2.3. We're thinking there might be a 2.2.5 release. We're not 100% sure on that yet, but there's some previous debugs, some previous security advisories we'd like to pull in, and a couple of things we've had found locally, like some cross-site scripting things, and there's also some IPsec improvements we're looking to pull back in. So there might be a 2.2.5. It's not 100%, but if there is, you can expect that in the fairly recent future, next month or so. We're still pushing through, trying to edit the book, get that all up to date. Our little SG2220 units, I have here noted that it's shipping in a few days, but a little birdie told me they've been shipping for a couple of days. So if you ordered one, I would expect it in the near future. And if you haven't seen anything about that device, it's our low-end device. I think it's only $299. It's got 2 ports and a dual core system and 2 gig of RAM. So it's a good endpoint node, sort of like what the ALIX or APU type things would have filled that gap. A little bit about what we're doing this month. I'll briefly and probably vastly oversimplify a bit of information about Radius and LDAP. We'll go over areas of pfSense that support Radius and LDAP, configuring Radius and LDAP servers for use by pfSense. I'll very briefly go over like what you would need to set up on like free Radius or Active Directory, that kind of thing. Radius and LDAP, using it for pfSense GUI authentication, using it for VPNs, for Captive Portal, and also for WPA2 Enterprise or 802.1x for wireless authentication. Most of the topics behind these things, the user manager, VPNs, Captive Portal, and wireless, we went over in previous Hangouts not too long ago. So I might gloss over some details when it comes to doing the rest of those things, and I'm just focusing on the authentication portions. All right, first up, a little bit about Radius. Radius is an acronym, stands for Remote Authentication Dial-In User Service. Mainly used by ISPs for dial-up and DSL over the years, and companies sometimes use it for central auth, or they hook it into something. There are ways to hook Radius and LDAP together where you can query both. Active Directory will let you query both ways. Lots of different implementations, a lot of them based on free Radius these days. Radiator is a popular commercial package for Unix that also handles some Radius tasks. You can also use Radius in Windows Server through the network policy services. Used to be, I think it was IAS in older versions. And there's also various front ends and things that include free Radius like Dollar Radius or billing systems. So there's a billing system I used at a previous job called BillMax that had Radius integrated into it. So it pops up in lots of different places. So you can do authentication, and it can also send back reply information about users. So you can have information on a user account that will send back info. Depending on the subsystem, what supports it, you might be able to send back information about how much bandwidth a user can use or what IP address to give them, that sort of stuff. Radius accounting allows you to track usage over time. So when somebody logs in or logs out, or if interim accounting, it may update periodically, it will record in the Radius server, this user was on at this time, they logged in at X time, they've transferred this much data, they logged out at that much time. Sort of a just a tracking of user activity. Some billing systems will key off of that, as well as features and things like there's a feature in our free Radius 2 package where you can limit people to a specific amount of data per day, or login time, total login time. We'll gloss over that a little bit and talk a little bit about that later. I'm not going to get too deep into some of those because they vary so much by what your Radius implementation supports. One good thing about Radius, it can be compatible with external systems like one-time password tokens and multi-factor implementations, things like that. Again, it ties back to your Radius server, what it supports, what it can hook into. Now, the Radius protocol itself is not encrypted. Certain ways that you can set it up and do certain protocols, the credentials may be encrypted, but still certain aspects of the protocol are not encrypted. So it's best to run it locally or over a VPN. You really don't want that information flowing free and clear over the internet, so just try to protect that traffic. All right, moving on to LDAP. Stands for Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Mostly it's a repository of information for the organization. It contains data about users. You can use it for authentication by binding to an LDAP entry, but you can also search it for other information, group memberships, email contacts and profile information. I know there are things like application deployment and Unix user permissions and things like that that can come out of LDAP, depending on, again, your implementation schema and whatnot. You'll find LDAP all over the place. Open LDAP is one big thing. There's also Active Directory, Novell Directory, or eDirectory services. Apple Open Directory, lots of things are either use LDAP or LDAP based, or offer an LDAP interface to what they have. There are some distributions of Unix like ClearOS and Turnkey Linux that use Open LDAP and kind of give you a clicky GUI you can use to set stuff up. One thing though, LDAP schemas vary a ton. Generally, there's two big groups they fall into, but everybody's schema is going to be different. So it's very hard to say a lot of the stuff, generally speaking. The major two I'm going to touch on here, but Open LDAP by default uses the RFC 2307 style, where group membership is listed on the group object. So like if you look through your tree in LDAP and you open up a group, on the group you'll find a list of users that are a member of that group. But if you open up the user, it doesn't necessarily tell you. You might have a GID, but it won't give you a list of groups. The flip of the coin from that is the RFC 2307 BIS or BIS Active Directory style, where the groups are their own entities, but if you open up a user, the groups that they're a member of are listed on the user. So really, that really depends on your LDAP schema. And there's no way for me to know what that is, so you just have to check with your schema and everything else before you proceed. You can use SSL to encrypt your queries with LDAP. I'll touch on that a little bit. Basically, you have to be using DNS. You have to have a certificate on the server that has the host name that you're using to access the LDAP server as the common name of the certificate. And it has to be using SSL on a specific port. So we'll go over that a little bit more in detail when it comes to setting that up. Now, how all these tie into pfSense, again, it varies by location and feature. GUI authentication on 224 and before was tied into just LDAP. You couldn't do a Radius. However, when I was researching this Hangout, I thought, well, that's kind of silly. Wonder what it would take. And so I went ahead and found out how to pass group info back from Radius, and I fixed that and got a fix in. It'll be in 225 if we have it. If not, it'll be in 2.3. So yeah, you can, so on 225 and later, you can pass back groups in a class attribute from Radius. It's just got to be a string coming back from the server. And then with LDAP, you have to have your group info set right. VPN auth and with the GUI auth, I'll go into more detail on this later, but you have to make groups on pfSense that match the groups you have on your authentication server. So if you have a group called like admins on pfSense that you want to use, then you would add a group to your LDAP server, Radius server called admins, or VPN users, or whatever you want to call it. Okay, for VPN authentication, OpenVPN, it can do Radius or LDAP, and Radius gets a little fancier because we have support in our code to pass IP addresses, routes, firewall rules, and DNS servers back over Radius. So different users could have different OpenVPN profile information in Radius, and all of that can be passed back out to clients dynamically. I'll show you some examples a little bit later, including one working example and then a couple more just basic syntax examples of how that works. IPsec supports Radius and LDAP. It doesn't support passing back any information from either of those at this time, but you can authenticate from both. The PPPoE server, L2TP server, they support Radius. There's just settings on their own pages to set that up. PPTP is dead. It does support Radius, but I'm not gonna show anything for that because it's dead and dying and should not be used. For Captive Portal, at this time, it only does Radius. The portal settings are all, the Radius settings are all on the portal. You can pass back per user bandwidth restrictions from Radius, and also time day limits, total transfer limits can be enacted by the Radius server. So that's up to your Radius server to implement those. I think there's a couple other fields I have noted later on too. We'll talk about that more. Wireless, also Radius only. It does 802.1x, which is also known as WPA or WPA2 Enterprise. Okay, just basic general info, and then I'll get into a little bit more specific info about what you need to do to set up your authentication server. First, you need to make sure the firewall can query it. What that means depends on your authentication server. In some cases, it may mean actually enabling Radius or LDAP on your auth server. It may mean adding a client entry that the firewall will be matched by. It may end up even just being allowing it through firewall rules or getting connectivity to it. All that falls under there. Obviously, you have to have your users and groups on your auth server. And then you need to determine the required parameters that pfSense needs to know about it. The address of the server it's going to use, the ports, if it needs a client shared secret, and base DN, stuff like that. But we'll get into a few more specifics here. Sorry. The easiest way to do Radius is to use the free Radius 2 package in pfSense. You can use an external Radius server if you've already got one, if you know how to use it, whatever you want to do, that's all up to you. I'm just saying the easiest thing to do if you just want to play around with Radius or get started with it. And now we have plenty of deployments using it this way. You can just use that. Nuts and bolts of it is you install the package. Let's go to System Packages. It's just marked Free Radius 2. You'll see it's already installed here. And there's an upgrade, an update. Then it's under Services and Free Radius. There's a few things you need to do. Obviously, add in your users, but I'll go into those a little bit more detail in a moment. The most important things you need to do here on the Settings tab, most of these defaults are okay. You might want to change some of the logging options. If it's going to be fairly busy, you might want to increase some of the thread pool settings. But most of these are okay. The key things are you need to add an interface. Like I've got here, I have one for accounting and one for authentication. They're just binding to all addresses. See the star for the interface address. You could have different instances listening on different specific IP addresses and different ports. That's up to you. Just the bare bones here, I've got listening on all interfaces, port 1812. This one is only authentication, IPv4, just says auth. Once you've got an interface, you have to define your clients. I've got 3 clients I'm dealing with. This 127.0.0.1, that's localhost for this particular firewall, which will be for, I'm going to show you GUI authentication here. I've got this other one. Second client here, that's going to be for VPNs and wireless, and this third client down here is for Captive Portal. Basically, you just, for these client definitions, you just put in the IP address of the client. Now that's going to be the IP address that the auth server is going to see from the query. You've got a short name here, that's just a nickname that you want to show up in various places in Free Radius for this particular client. And then a shared secret, which is a password. You can generate something long and random there. You don't want that to be short or guessable. But this isn't a user password. This is actually the password for the server itself to let so that the Radius server knows that this particular firewall is authorized to make queries. Right here I've got this listed as UDP, client type other. This is all default down here, and I just added a description for myself. The others are all set up the same. Basically, all you need to fill in is the IP address, the short name, and the shared secret. The other defaults are fine. Once you've got that, just have your users. Now, since I'm going to be using these users throughout this demonstration, I'll show you a few things of what I've got here. This particular one is GIMP, or GIMP, my account here. And most of these things, again, default, because I don't have myself restricted. But I will just show you here a couple of neat little things I've got. We'll touch on a little bit too. I've got my class. These are the groups that I'm a member of. And I've got the Cisco AV pair here is how an OpenVPN route gets passed back. So later on when I demo OpenVPN, I'll show you. I'll have a route that shows up just for 8888 because it got passed back from Radius. This particular guy, Loggy, he is set up for only GUI log access. I've got him just as in a some logs group here. VPN guy, fairly unrestricted. I think I have them in the class of VPN users, but the VPNs don't key off the class at this time. It's just things I was doing to make sure groups worked. Wi-Fi here is a Wi-Fi user. Again, fairly unrestricted. Cappy is a captive portal user. I do have no restrictions on this one. However, this guy down here, CP limit, he has, I put in an amount of upload and download traffic on a daily limit. Obviously, I can't demonstrate, that cutting them off, but it's just showing you how you do it. I've also got maximum bandwidth down and up, so this particular user can't do any more than 1 megabit down and 256K up. And then it will send interim accounting data to the server every 10 minutes. So at most they could transfer a little more than this over a 10-minute period, and then they get cut off. All right, and that's really it for the Radius stuff. If you want to do Radius on Active Directory, you do need in the server manager. This is on server 2012, 2008, maybe a little bit different. I know, and earlier is a lot different. So I'm just going to focus on 2012 here. You need to add the network access policy server NAP. It might be listed under network policy server, things like that. You may just have to Google for the exact name. Network policy server is what it shows up as here. And when you're in the network policy server, there's just two main key things you need to worry about. First is a client, which is roughly akin to the NAS client's entry in FreeRadius. You give it a friendly name, which is like the client short name or client nickname, IP address, just like the address in FreeRadius, and then a shared secret. You can have it generate you one automatically, or you can manually enter your own. Aside from the client, you have to have network policies. I have this one just as allow from pfSense. You can see the condition is that the users are a member of the VPN users group, which I've got in Active Directory, and access permission is grant. Can do unencrypted. This is just making sure it can talk to Radius. PPP and framed. You can add other conditions and constraints. You could add multiple groups if you wanted to make sure they're members of all those groups, and I can't remember. There's vendor specific or here. Yeah, there's ways you can add in other Radius reply attributes here if you need to send back something that is supported by one of the other areas. Just watch the types on those, because most of the types we have are mainly geared toward FreeRadius. There might be something. I think class is treated differently by NPS than it is by FreeRadius. I think NPS wants to send it in binary, and FreeRadius wants to send it as a string. But so I think we parse it as a string. So you just got to watch out for things like that. And similar to FreeRadius, I've got a few people here. I have the GIMP account, the Loggy account, a couple other guys. VPN guy. As you'll see, like on the GMP group, one thing you need to make sure is on this dial-in tab, make sure it has control access through NPS network policy. I know their text there is a little redundant. Network policy, server network policy. But you need to make sure of that. I know you can see I'm a member of the admins group and VPN users and so on and so forth. This loggy person, again, like on FreeRadius, I made them a little bit different here because I didn't have my some logs group. What can I do? Why don't I put him in that instead? Member of some logs, and then he doesn't need to be admin. There we go. Now he's better. And so you just need to make sure you got your users set up, make sure they've got the right, make sure they're in the right groups, make sure their dial-in settings are right if you want them to come through Radius. Same thing sort of goes for LDAP. You got to. I don't think LDAP checks the dial-in permission or anything, but just make sure they're all set up and in the right groups. It's way too complicated to go into how to configure OpenLDAP because there's just so many different ways to do it, so many different schemas, and there's tons of how-tos out there and ways that'll automate it. I've had a little LDAP test here set up in a FreeBSD jail with PHP LDAP admin for a while, and it's fairly straightforward here. Once I've got it set up, you can see I've got some groups and I've got my people here. But if you're going to use SSL, make sure you have your cert and make sure it meets the criteria I said before. Hostname has to exist in DNS, either local DNS or public DNS. Common name of the certificate has to be the host name you have as the common name of the certificate, or the host name in DNS. So that's got to match. And your LDAP server entry in pfSense has to be talking to that host name. So those are the most important things to watch out for. Like I said, there's distros like Turnkey Linux and ClearOS that have GUIs for OpenLDAP that you might be able to leverage if you want, or do it the command line way. I know Ubuntu, if you just install OpenLDAP a certain way, it prompts you to set it up and asks you a couple of questions and sets it up for you. Fairly straightforward. With Active Directory, the support's already there in Windows Server. You don't really have to do anything special. If you want to use SSL in an Active Directory, you do have to add the certificate authority role, Active Directory certificate services. I didn't get that working on this one because I had made the mistake of setting the server up a long time ago with a different name, and I went to change the domain and it wreaked all sorts of havoc. So ignore my mess here, but I will show you SSL with OpenLDAP because that I've had working for quite some time. On Active Directory, if you do not know what your base DN and other settings are, if you open up ADSI edit, makes it really easy to browse and shows you your base DN here, like mine is DC equals example, comma, DC equals com. And you could even drill down and see your different groups and how things are organized. And if you go down and look at even just a specific person, you can scroll down on their attributes and look at it and you can even find a distinguished name just all the way down for a specific user. So if you're looking to monkey around with LDAP and Active Directory, ADSI edit's a good way to get started with trying to find your settings. And for others like Novell and Apple, you're kind of on your own. I didn't have handy examples to show for those, but you can, there's plenty of documentation out there on how to find all that stuff and turn it on and do whatever you need to do. Okay, so what we need to do now is set up pfSense for a Radius server. Flip back over here. Now we need to go under System and User Manager onto the Servers tab. Now when you first go in here and you click plus, you'll have your type choice up here for Radius or LDAP. After you save this, it gets locked. So you can't change your mind and decide to change it later. You just have to make a new entry. When you change that to radius, it locks it in here. Host name or IP, that's the address of the radius server. Shared secret, that's the password or shared secret, set up in the NAS clients I showed you. Services offered, it again depends on the server. It could be authentication only, it could be both, it could be just accounting. Normally it's rare we'd have one just for accounting here, more for authentication and accounting. Port values are good at default unless you know better, unless you've changed it. And then authentication timeout, it defaults to 5 seconds. You could increase that a little bit if you know your radius server is a little slow or across a slow link. Show you over here on servers, I've got my local radius. This is just set up to talk to free radius to locally. I just got the local host, got my shared secret, set for authentication, port 1812, 5-second timeout. That's it, easy peasy. So if I go up here to diagnostics and authentication, if I've got it set for local radius at the top, if I do my GMP account, it'll show these groups. Again, this groups thing with radius only works on 225 snapshots, or if we put out a 225, or it will work on 2.3, though the code's not merged into 2.3 yet. But it is there in the 225 snapshots. So, and then if I log, and actually I am logged into the GUI with the GMP account right now. But if I do log E here, see it's just in the group some logs. And if I do CP limit, no, he didn't show up in any groups, which is fine, but it is a valid account. And if we just do that, he's not actually in there, so authentication failed. So now, after checking the accounts and everything, we know it's good. So that's all that it takes to set it up for a radius server. Now LDAP is a bit more involved. When you go to make an LDAP server, there are several choices you need to make. Obviously, you select LDAP here. You got to fill in all this other info. Hostname or IP address. Again, if you're using SSL, you have to use a hostname here, and that hostname has to match the common name of the server certificate on the LDAP server. Port, the defaults are generally okay here. If you're just using standard, it's 389. SSL, if you pick that, it'll switch the port 636. That's the default there. Peer certificate authority. If you want to use SSL again, you have to, before you come here even, you have to import the certificate authority into the pfSense in the cert manager. Protocol version 3, that's what most things are going to use in general. You can step that down to 2 if you know yours only does 2. Server timeout, this is also new for 225. We've had some instances where accessing LDAP servers would really slow down GUI access if the LDAP server was down. If you put in a low timeout here, like with radius, you could put in 5 or 10 seconds. It will greatly ease the process when things go wrong. If things go wrong, it will fall back to local authentication. And that's something I didn't mention too, and I'll get to it yet when we go over the GUI authentication. If the remote authentication fails, it will fall back to local users. Here, the search scope, your level is either one level or entire subtree. I'll tell you right now, 99 times out of 100, this should be on entire subtree, unless you know better. Especially, you might find that like extended query or group membership, things like that don't work unless you put in an entire subtree. Again, especially with Active Directory, that should always be entire subtree. Base DN, you put in what you found here, like in PHP LDAP admin, it's up here at the base of everything. In ADSI edit, it's right here. Authentication containers, it's usually your users, your primary group of users. If you press select here, it will let you browse the containers that are on your server. I'll show you that here in a moment. Extended query, I'll show you an example of here in a moment too. It lets you filter things by group. So say you want to have LDAP authentication, but you only want users in your VPN group to be able to authenticate, you'd set that up in an extended query. Bind credentials, some LDAP servers will let you do anonymous binds, others won't. Generally speaking, Open LDAP, yes. Active Directory, no. You might need to make a service account or a user account with proper permissions to bind in order to do this. And if you do, you got to fill those in. Initial template here. This, again, try to match it to what you've got, either Open LDAP, Active Directory, or Novell eDirectory. In the case of Open LDAP, this may need to change, the default may need to change a little bit yet, because as I found when I was doing this, really you want something that looks closer to this here. User naming is CN, group naming is CN, group member is member UID. And then, as I explained a little bit ago, you have the choice of using the RFC 2307 style groups, where if you check that box, it looks for members listed on groups. If it's unchecked, which is the default, it does Active Directory style, where it looks for group members listed, or group membership listed on the user object. So if you have this checked, you'll also want to fill in the group class, which defaults to POSIX group, which is, at least in the examples I saw, was what should be used. But I made it a free-form field because it could vary from LDAP schema to LDAP schema. If your usernames or passwords are going to include UTF-8 or Unicode characters, things like that, you want to check the box to enable UTF-8 support. It's not checked by default because, quite frankly, we don't know if all LDAP servers support it or not, and we'd rather err on the side of safety. For username alterations here, sometimes you might want them to log in with like a username at hostname. In this case, if you have that unchecked, it's going to only send through the username portion of that to the backend server. If you check that, it will send the whole thing user at host all the way through. And I'll show you a couple more things here. These authentication containers, if you hit select, it does a little query to the LDAP server, and you can just check the containers you want. You need to make sure your bind credentials are right before that. And I had an issue on Firefox where it was pre-filling the admin saved password here. So make sure if you need anonymous binds, uncheck that, make sure it has no username and password in there, then recheck it, then hit select. See if we come over here to this one. Let's look. I've got Active Directory hooked up on this one. And you can see here, oh, no, it was already set. I just didn't like it. Nah, mostly what I came here for was this guy. The extended query. In this case, I wanted to only allow, as the name implies, VPN only. I wanted to make sure this only allowed VPN users. So this group I'm going to use for VPN authentication later, or this instance I'm going to use for VPN authentication later. So I've got member of equals CN equals VPN users, comma, CN equals users, comma, dc.example.com. So that's just the full DN of my VPN users group underneath here. Again, if you don't know what that is, pop into ADSI edit. Here's my VPN users group. And you get the whole distinguished name here. But the most important part is that you need to have the search parameter there before it, which is member of equals. As you can see here for Active Directory, this one's got SAM account name, CN, and member of. And back over here to this one, just so you see, this one is set for SSL. If you are just set for plain TCP, everything, credentials and all, will be sent in the clear, which is a very bad thing. Even locally, you don't want that. So you really want to make sure you can do SSL. So do everything you can to get SSL working. If you're just testing it or trialing it or trying to get it to work, it's easier to start with TCP. Then once you've got your settings dialed in, then switch on SSL, just so you know you're chasing the right problem. initial templates, blah, blah, blah. Yep. And yeah, just when you go to check this out, again, diagnostics authentication. And then admins and VPN users, which as you can see here, they correspond to my groups that I've got here. I have admins, sublogs, and VPN users. You could have, they can be in more groups on the Active Directory side, but those won't show through. The only ones that are going to show through are the ones that exist here on pfSense. And then again here, and this one goes through Active Directory. I tried to set them up similarly, so they've got admins and VPN users. So just test all those out. Okay, so it's very important to note these groups. If you're looking to use GUI authentication here on the firewall, you need to make sure these groups are showing up when you run your tests. If the groups don't show up when you run your tests, then your GUI auth is not going to work, period. So you need to make sure that your auth is working and the groups show up before you do anything else. And that, that includes, like I said, you got to have them in the groups on the servers. You have to have the right settings on your auth server settings so the groups show through, and you have to have your groups here locally. Admins obviously can get to everything. I've got some logs limited, just looking at some logs and status info. Just very basic set of pages. And my VPN users group, it doesn't, it has various VPN permissions, but these aren't actually going to be consulted at the moment. I just wanted to have some permissions on there, just to show you what it would do. Alrighty. Once you've got your group showing through in diagnostics authentication, you've got your server entry in there, everything looks like it's okay, you can come over here to the settings tab and pick your server. You can do session timeouts if you want. This in the settings tab, the session timeout works even without using a server. The default's 4 hours. You can lower that down. We recommend lowering it down quite a bit. Too low can be a little annoying if you leave a window open and you want to come back to it, but you really don't want to leave that session active forever. So yeah, just set your authentication server. You can hit for LDAP. You can do save and test if you want, or just plain save for Radius, or if you don't want to run its little test. It just wants to go. So I tried to. It wanted to run a little test. Yeah, see, it just shows it tried to get through to bind. And shows you what it found. All right, so that's it for doing GUI auth. Let's move on to VPNs. I showed you how to limit for LDAP for an extended filter. If we come over here to this guy, under mobile clients, I've got it set for Radius right now, but I could have picked the LDAP server. So it's handled here, and this on IPsec and OpenVPN. If you have multiple servers here, you can control click them. It will try one. If that fails, it will move on and try the next one. We don't have a way to reshuffle the ordering of that at the moment, however, so just you might need to make sure you add them in the right order if you want to prefer one server over the other, if you intend on using multiple. Now on IPsec here, this only works for XAuth style authentication. It does not currently work for IKV2 like EAP, MSCHAP. We don't have that working yet. So we have a how-to on the doc wiki for how to set up this style of mobile IPsec, and you can set it up that way, and then just the only difference between this and a regular one is instead of using local here, you actually use your you just use whichever ones you had selected. Actually, I had that set for both Radius servers. That's the only difference. Let's see. Next. Oh, L2TP, PPPoE, and PPTP, they have radius, but they're not bound into the user manager. So like if you look here, there are radius server settings that you can enable. You just pop in the server IP shared secret. They can pull IPs back by radius using the framed IP address return, but that's not something we're going to get into today. We're just going to focus on these other parts. All right, for OpenVPN, we can do either radius or LDAP. And as you'll see here, I've got two servers. I set one up for LDAP. This one here, I've got it set to my VPN only group. And then the other one, I've got set up for just plain radius. Now they'll work with any auth mode, which is either authentication only or for SSL TLS plus user auth. If you're looking to use the client export package, I have these both to set to authentication only, so users don't have their own individual certificates. What that does in the client export is it gives you one installer that you can hand to everybody, which, as the classic trade-off tells you, it's convenient, but it's not secure. If you want to do SSL TLS with user auth, you need to make these individual certificates. You don't have to make local users. You just need to go into the cert manager and make a certificate from the CA that, for the OpenVPN server, and just try to make the CN of the certificates match the username. That's the key thing to worry about. And then as you make those certificates, they will show up in this list. Each certificate will have its own separate installer. But if you're only looking for authentication only, it's really simple. You just get one installer. Everybody uses the same installer, and then it only checks the radius credentials. For radius reply attributes, you can pass back to the clients. There's a Cisco AV pair that's route equals, and it uses the standard OpenVPN style for route. You put in the network ID, which looks like the IP address, and then the subnet mask. You can pass back DNS servers. It's a space-separated list of IP addresses. You can also do firewall rules, either in ACL and out ACL, and they're in Cisco ACL style, so they use a wildcard mask. It was done that way primarily because it was a standard type thing that people were already used to. So you can have like a rule that says, permit from this, permit from one IP address to any or whatever, or permit from any to, and then a specific host name, or deny from there to any. And whatever order they come through from radius is the order that they'll be put in the rule set. So just keep that in mind. And you can also pass back a framed IP address reply attribute from radius that it's just an IP address, one IP. The client will take that IP address and it will add one to it, and the server's that plus one. Now generally it's the other way around, where the server's one less than the client. I'm not sure why that was chosen this way. It's just when I followed through the code, that's how it was set. And if you want to do multi-factor auth, you can do that with the radius if the radius server supports it. But that's, again, between you and your radius server and whatever backends you've got. I'll just show you a little bit with how these work. I've got my ShrewSoft client here set up to connect. And if I just do my account, Jim P. And there it is, tunnel enabled. So now my IPsec tunnel is up. And let me do 2.1. Just show you it's working. There it is, talking across the VPN. And it was authenticated through, it was radius I had that set for. And now let me close out of that. If I fire up OpenVPN, Now 1194 was my VPN only, so even though my logi user is valid, it should fail because he was not in the VPN group. See, auth failed. But then if I use my GMP user, there I am. And I'm logged in. And I can still get the 2.1. Now this one was set for LDAP, so it's not going to show, but you see the routes all show okay. Now if I disconnect from this one, and then connect to this other one with my GMP account, this is pulling from Radius. I'm all connected, and you can see I've got my 888 route came through from Radius. And that's all there was to it. All right. Now, Radius for Captive Portal. Captive Portal can't do LDAP, just Radius. All of these settings for this are on the Captive Portal zone here. It doesn't hook into the user manager Radius, so you have to fill these settings in here. You just have to set it for Radius authentication, and then whichever Radius protocol your Radius server is set up to support. CHAP MD5 is a bit more secure than PAP, but I was just looking to get it working. Then that's the address of the Radius server, which is the other VM I had up, that port, and my shared secret. I have it sending accounting packets to port 1813, and I'm using an interim accounting. I have it set to re-authenticate connector users every minute. What this does is every minute that the CPU Captive Portal user is logged in, it's going to send another access request to the Radius server saying, okay, I'm going to try to log in again. Is it okay? I'm going to try to log in again. Is it okay? Over and over and over again. What that does is if they cross some limit, either a time limit, bandwidth limit, or whatever on the Radius server, the minute that is passed, then boom, that will fail and they'll get kicked out. So if you want to pass back any sort of limits, there's the way to do it. You could do Radius MAC authentication. If you do that, it sends the MAC address as the username automatically, and that MAC authentication secret is the password it sends through. Some people use that like at an ISP type level to automatically authenticate users through a portal, just to make sure there's a known, like a whitelist of devices that are allowed through. We've had people hook that into scripts and things to automatically populate it. All a matter of preference. Radius NAS IP, it's what you want to show up in like the Radius accounting messages for the calling station, or called station, I think that is actually. I think that text is wrong. Session timeout, it will try to pull the session timeout reply attribute and use that. So if you want to pass back a session timeout to say, a dynamic thing where certain users can be logged in for an hour, certain others get 2 hours, things like that, and Radius can pass back their session timeout. Again, when you have anything like that, it needs to be coupled with the re-authentication, and also I think you also need to have a hard timeout set up above too. Radius type, most of the time you leave that at default. You can change that to another type if you know your Radius server keeps things in a different format or expects things in a different format. Mostly that type just switches around the called station ID and calling station ID behavior. Sorry, I had to cough there. NAS identifier, this is a little bit different. This is what the firewall is going to send to identify the NAS itself. It could be a host name or some other identifier that may not change like the IP does. It wouldn't be used where an IP is used necessarily. It could be a short name, something like that. And MAC address format, again, depends on your Radius and other backend systems, how they expect to see a MAC address. Default is typical MAC address style like you'd see in our GUI. Some things expect like a Cisco format or IETF format, or it gets put in with like a single dash or multiple dashes instead of colons or dots, and or just a string of numbers. You might have noticed up here there is a primary source that also has a primary and a secondary source that has a primary and a secondary. What that is, if the primary is primary is down, it will go to the primary. Secondary, but if those fail, that would be the end of it. If you have the primary and the secondary, they can be two completely different systems. Like we've had people use like a prepaid card program type thing in Radius Server up here, and then it would fall through to a user auth thing. So either way would be valid. If this server is alive but rejects, it won't fall down to this. That's what this would do. If this responds with a reject, it goes through to the secondary. If this doesn't respond at all, it will fall through to the secondary down here into that one. I know the logic is the naming logic is a little confusing. It's kind of hard to get that across. And let's see, I already covered all that. Oh, you can pass back some of the radius reply attributes here. Again, it varies by your radius vendor what they want to format it with, but the most common one is whisper bandwidth max up and whisper bandwidth max down for passing back specific bandwidth to on a user. You've got the redirection URL, so you can pass through a custom post authentication redirection URL to somebody. The accounting interim or interval, which how often it sends back the data. Also session timeout and idle timeout. Those can all be passed back from Radius. And I know it's tempting on your Radius to set it so that a user can only be logged in once at a time, but that's not compatible with Captive Portal, especially if you're doing the reauthentication, because it may try to authenticate them twice at various times to verify that their account is still valid. So things, just how it hooks in there, that's just the best way to do it. Okay, next one down. After Captive Portal is Radius for wireless, and how that works. It's 802.1x, also known as WPA or WPA2 Enterprise. It's more secure than plain WPA because you don't have a shared key. It's less prone to brute forcing. It's harder to snoop. With WPA2, even if somebody has the key and they can sniff your the traffic you have joining the access point association traffic, they can decrypt your traffic. So yes, it's encrypted from everybody else, but it's not necessarily safe from other people there with you on the access point. So that's where WPA2 Enterprise, everybody has their own credentials and keys and everything. Sorry. WPA Enterprise only supports Radius, no LDAP support at this time. Although you could, Free Radius has a mode where you can backend it by LDAP, so you could auth through Radius that falls through to LDAP, sort of thing like that. Most important thing here to note is that you need to have WPA key. Well, it's got to have WPA has to be on. You've got to have this set to WPA2 ideally, but WPA key management mode has to be set to extensible authentication protocol. It's got to be set to EAP. And when you log in on your client, you can set it to PEEP or something like that. You may have to look at your client settings to be certain what it is. I'm trying to connect one of my clients here. Just a second. See if I can get this guy to come on. There we go. So to set that there, you pop in your Radius server IP port and your shared secret, and off you go. You can do a secondary server if the first is if the first one's down, it'll do the second one. There's also a roaming pre-auth if you want. That would play havoc with simultaneous use again, but if it wants to roam, it's going to try to authenticate to the new app and hand you off rather than waiting to, until you roam to cut you off. But if we come back over here to wireless, you'll see my clients online. And if we look at the wireless log, you can see where I authenticated as Jim P. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear that the host app D or the client scan lets you grab the username here in the wireless status, but I'm not sure if that's an OS level limitation or if there's some way we can actually find that. But it's there. You will just have to check your logs to see the users at this time. But there may be a way around that. We can look into it in the future. Also, something to look forward to in the future too. We don't have this support in our GUI yet, but the backend daemon does support dynamic VLAN assignment based on based on info passed back from Radius. I was kind of curious to play with that, but I didn't have enough time, and I said I was under the weather the last couple of weeks. So I didn't get to that. Eventually, all these areas are going to converge on the user manager. So things like the 802.1x and Captive Portal and L2TP, PPTP, all that kind of stuff, they're all going to fall back to using Radius settings or maybe even gain LDAP support in some areas. It might be impossible for things like host app D where we actually have to write out the Radius settings. But some of the things support, ways that we can script up the auth in our own way. But that's pretty good. And now, now that I'm hitting the end here, I realized that I never actually showed a few things. I didn't actually demo the GUI auth or the Captive Portal login, but I'll show you real quick here. You see I've got my groups, and the groups had the permissions. I did show you that. You see here there are no local users. So if I log out, if I log in as Loggy, you can see I went right to logs. If I look under the menus, just like with the user manager, limited privileges means you have limited ability to get around in the GUI. And then if I log out and log back in as me, I've got access to everything. Just like that. Now for a quick little Captive Portal demo. So I just tried to load an HTTP site, couldn't get through, log in with my CP limit user. And bam, I'm online. And as you can see, it's taking its sweet time drawing the page because it's limited to 1 megabit per second. And let's go over here and show you status Captive Portal. You can see I'm logged into the portal. If we look at the logs, you'll see it logged me in as the CP limit user. And I believe that's it. So there are, as I mentioned, there's some areas for improvement as we go along here. But if you have any questions, I guess you go ahead and type them away now. How do you define multiple search criteria? George, was that in LDAP, in the LDAP server settings? If that was, I believe, that's really up to whatever the server expects in that extended filter field. I believe there's syntax for that, but I don't know it off the top of my head. I think you have to like put things in parentheses with the right operators between them. I don't know the LDAP search syntax off the top of my head, but I saw some examples of that as I was going, and it was just a matter of, I think you have to have like, one thing in parentheses and then a bar and then the next thing in parentheses after that. But that's something you'd have to experiment with. You can use something like Apache Directory Studio to run queries against your LDAP server and see what gets returned. And it's a really I don't have it installed on this workstation, but it's a really nice piece of software if you're not familiar with LDAP and you want to browse and search queries and tinker. Once you get it working there, you should be able to copy over the extended filter type syntax over. All right, anybody else? Any questions? The name of the Apache software. Let me triple check that. I believe it's Apache Directory Studio. Yeah, it's it's org, isn't it? Oh, there it is. I must have typoed it. There you go. Directory.apache.org/studio. It's Apache Directory Studio. It's got a good LDAP browser, schema editor type things. You can poke around and do a lot of stuff in LDAP. When I was trying to research the group stuff, the RFC 2307 group stuff that I had fixed before when I was researching this Hangout, that's how I was running my queries to try and figure out, okay, well, how do I do this? How do I do that? And that was all, I did all of that in Apache Directory Studio. And then I adapted the code to what I found in Apache Directory Studio. LDAP group auth VLAN. No, we don't have anything about group auth to a VLAN. The only thing that involved VLANs even potentially was hostappd. That was for wireless clients only, and that was radius only. And I don't have the syntax for that off the top of my head, but if you look in the hostappd.conf man page, it's floating out there on the internet. It has some examples for how that works. I don't know if the interface style it uses is compatible with how we do things. That's why it's not supported. It might be in the future, but it's not something you just want to try and hack in. For IPsec with EAP MS Chat v2, add the pfSense CA cert on the NPS server. It's not that that would be incorrect to do. The problem is at the moment, the way we write out these secrets for EAP MS Chat v2 in StrongSwan, it does it directly into the keys. There's no mode indication where it should go back to radius for that info. It needs some extra configuration love to tie that in a way where it will actually send that stuff back to radius properly. Right now that code just doesn't exist because it assumes the entries are going to be on the pre-shared keys tab set for EAP. There's no way to have it fall through and get that stuff from radius right now. That's something we're looking into. I don't know if it'll make 2.3. It may have to come after. But I know everybody wants IKV2 like that. When it works really well, and doesn't have half the problems that other implementations had, like L2TP and IPsec. It's just a mess, but IKV2 is pretty sweet when you get it working. It's pretty straightforward. That's something that one of these days I need to do an updated IPsec or maybe a mobile VPN hangout where I talk about some stuff like that. All right, any more questions? Anything else? guess if there's nothing else, I can start wrapping up here. So we've got 2.3 to look out for in the near future, maybe a 2.25 before then. A lot of good fun stuff happening. Our bootstrap builds of 2.3 are looking really nice. The functionality is getting there. There's still some issues we got to iron out, but the code's all in the repository, but we don't have the public snapshots up yet, just because it's not in a state yet where we want the world to hack away at it with us. But we want to get some stuff cleaned up and at least at a good starting point before we get to that point. And so that's I think that may just be about it. So if there's no more questions, I'll go ahead and wrap it up. Again, sorry for my voice troubles today, but I'm going to have to go rest my voice for a while and maybe go cough for about 5 minutes straight. But if that's it, I'll see you all next time.